Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week, on our Against the Odds poll, we had an all-future sight edition of the Against the Odds poll, and in the end, it was a gravestorm card. In fact, the only gravestorm card in all of Magic, Bitter Ordeal, coming out on top. So this week, we're heading to Modern to see if we can somehow kill some opponents with Bitter Ordeal. A quick reminder before we break down the deck. If you enjoy this deck and you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So, Bitter Ordeal is a really weird card. It's sort of a Lost Legacy, Cranial Extraction type effect. Basically, for 3 mana, you get to search your opponent's library. Well, I guess you can do it on yourself, but typically you target your opponent. Search their library for a card, remove it from the game, and that player shuffles his or her library. But this card has Gravestorm, which means it's copied for every permanent that was put into a graveyard from play. So if you crack a fetch, or a creature goes to the graveyard, whatever, as long as it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you get an extra copy of Bitter Ordeal. So the idea of this deck is obviously to power up Bitter Ordeal as much as possible, because hopefully we can exile all the relevant spells, or many of the relevant spells, from our opponent's deck, and we actually have a trick up our sleeves that can turn this into a 20 damage burn spell if things go right. So how do we power up Bitter Ordeal? First off, we need lots of things to sacrifice. So we play a bunch of different token generators that let us flood the board with tokens, and then when we sack the tokens, even though they kind of disappear, technically they go to the graveyard before they disappear, so they give us an extra copy of Bitter Ordeal to power it up. The target is to get up to 10. We want 10 total copies of Bitter Ordeal to win the game, although we can sometimes get by with a bit less. But Young Pyromancer, Monastery Mentor, they're creatures, so we can always sack themselves, but they also make tokens whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, and we got some instants and sorceries that we'll talk about in the future. Lingering Souls happens to be an instant or sorcery that we actually get to cast twice because we can flash it back, so it triggers Young Pyromancer, Monastery Mentor 2 times, and it gives us up to 4 tokens if we play it and flash it back. So flood the board with tokens, and then we can sacrifice those tokens to power up our Gravestorm ability on Bitter Ordeal. So, key card number 1 is Plunge into Darkness. This is kind of the secret sauce that makes the deck work, because it has Entwine, and it does 2 things we really want. First off, it lets us sack any number of creatures to gain a bunch of life. And gaining life is nice, but sacrificing creatures means we can play this for 2 mana, sack all our Lingering Souls tokens, Young Pyromancer tokens, Mentor tokens, all that stuff, get a ton of Gravestorm triggers, so then when we cast our Bitter Ordeal, we're casting it with a ton of copies. Also, it lets us find our Bitter Ordeal for 1 more mana, or one of our other combo pieces, because if we entwine it, we also get to pay X life, and look at the top X cards of our library, grab one of those cards, and exile the rest. So we can potentially, especially if we sack a bunch of creatures, look at the top 20, 30 cards of our library, which should be enough that we're always going to find Bitter Ordeal, always going to find something else. Like, we could use a Greater Gargadon, which is our other enabler here. So the thing that makes Greater Gargadon so awesome is not only does it let us sack all of our creatures, all of our tokens to power up our Bitter Ordeal, but it also lets us sack lands. So if we only have 4 or 5 tokens and creatures on the battlefield, we can also just sacrifice all of our lands to power up our Bitter Ordeal and make sure that we have enough copies to win the game. So you're probably wondering, why is 10 copies of Bitter Ordeal so important? And the answer is, our finisher, 2-card combo, Psychogenic Probe. So Psychogenic Probe takes advantage of one of the less obvious aspects of Bitter Ordeal. It does 2 damage to a player whenever they shuffle their library. So Bitter Ordeal, technically, even though the end result, let's say we have 10 copies of Bitter Ordeal, even though the end result is we search our opponent's library and we exile 10 cards, each of those copies resolves separately. So Bitter Ordeal number 1 resolves, we choose a card, exile it, and our opponent has to shuffle their library. Copy number 2 resolves, choose a card, exile it, opponent shuffles their library. So every single copy of Bitter Ordeal ends up being 2 damage. We're basically turning Bitter Ordeal into a weirdly powered up version of Grape Shot that does 2 damage, and we don't have to cast a bunch of spells. We just sack a bunch of stuff to Plunge into Darkness, to Greater Gargadon, and so forth. So that's kind of the plan for actually winning the game, is sack up to 10 things, cast a Bitter Ordeal with a Psychogenic Probe on the battlefield, and that's 20 damage to our opponent's face. As far as the rest of the deck, we have a bunch of spells, and these cards do double duty. So they help disrupt our opponent. Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt can kill our opponent's creatures. Inquisition, Thoughtseize, take cards out of our opponent's hand. But they also trigger Young Pyromancer and Monastery Mentor. So not only are we getting the effect we want out of them, we're also getting a bonus token that we can then sacrifice to Gargadon, sacrifice to Plunge into Darkness, to power up our Gravestorm. Mana base wise, bunch of fetches, Blood Crypt, Inspiring Vantage, Swamp. This is not all the lands. I didn't think it was important to talk about all of them. It basically is a typical modern mana base. We have 10 fetches, a few shock lands, a few fast lands, some basic lands. The only real special lands we have are Shambling Vent as a way to gain some life and beat down, and Westfall Abbey, which can make us tokens, and if we get to the way late game, also be a sacrifice outlet for 5 creatures to power up Gravestorm. As far as the sideboard, Surgical Extraction is pretty sweet. Not only is it relevant against Storm and other combo decks, but it's another way we can force our opponent to shuffle their library. So with a Psychogenic Probe out, it's a way we can deal some random damage to our opponent for free. Leyline of Sanctity protects us from discard, so our opponent can't Thoughtseize away our combo pieces. Stony Silence for Affinity, also for Tron. Then we have a bunch more removal. Path to Exile, Damnation, Wear Tear for artifacts and enchantments. Want to get rid of our opponent's Leylines of Sanctity and so forth. And then another Thoughtseize for combo, and that is Bitter Ordeal for Modern, and that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. So, is this going to work? I think maybe. So the thing I like about it is we have a lot of good cards. Young Pyromancer, Monastery Mentor, Lingering Souls. These are cards that can win us the game on their own, but we also have another line of attack if we can't win with our tokens, and that is the Bitter Ordeal Psychogenic Probe combo. Greater Gargadon works well with both halves of the deck. Like, we can just randomly block something with a token, sack to Gargadon, eventually get a huge 9/7 and win that way, or we can use it as a combo piece to sack all of our stuff and get the instant kill with Bitter Ordeal. So we're kind of like a Mardu tokens deck that has this surprise storm win, a Gravestorm win, that gets our opponent out of nowhere when they least expect it. So I think we can pick up some wins with this deck. I don't think it's going to be insane, but I think that we can pick up some wins because we have a lot of good cards, and the combo ends the game on the spot if we can get it assembled. Anyway, that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. Bitter Ordeal for Modern. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, take a second and click that like button down below. It's a great way to help support the channel for free. And you can find the next video in the playlist right here.